Hello, I'm Cara and I'm working on embroidering this little skull for a friend. I think this is going to be a test. I don't think this is going to be the final version. But anyway, stitching this skull, and I want to chat a little about Agatha Christie. Because I started at the beginning of the year. I decided I don't really do New Year's resolutions, but I have a goal to read all her books this year. And I'm always very flexible with things like goals and reading goals because I know it's very easy for me to reach a point where I'm supposed to do something and thus I don't want to. And the point of reading things, especially reading things like Agatha Christie, is just to enjoy it, right? There's not, yeah. So, anyway, I've read something like 35 of her books so far, novels and short story collections. I started just haphazardly. I don't currently own any of her books. I have in the past, but I've worked on, I know all my books are along that wall. The longest wall in my apartment is that wall in the living room, so that's where all my bookshelves are. Anyway, but I've owned some of her books in the past, but I've been trying not to let my library, my book collection, get even more ridiculous than it kind of is. I've gotten rid of given away or donated most things that I'm certain libraries will have. So, things like Agatha Christie and a lot of popular fiction, unless there's certain things that I know I want to, like I own The Lord of the Rings because I don't want to check it out, and also because I know that's something I will sometimes read like compulsively all the way through or most of the way through, and sometimes I'll stop and go a bunch. Anyway, the point being, I currently don't own any Agatha Christie. So, I have been going to the central branch of the Des Moines library system, and I started just pulling things off the shelves, rereading, because I've read some things before. So I'm read it before or seen a TV production before. I'm rereading everything. So I've read most of what's usually on the shelves at the central branch. So I'm having to put things on hold, and I've got a few Christies waiting for me at the library this week. So I'll go get them tomorrow or the next day. But part of the reason I decided to do that is because, in a lot of ways I've struggled feeling like a human being the last few years, and, on and off forever. It's not like this is completely new, but I've been a different kind of stuck the last few years, and this is a thing that, I like to read. It feels good to finish things, and Agatha Christie books are fast. They're written to be popular, to be, like beach reads or whatever. Anyway, so I haven't been going through with any, or at least I didn't start with any kind of plan or strategy as to what I read first. Though I have this very pretty scribbled lists and post-its and extra. I ran out of space of all her books. I have all the Poirot's, Tommy and Tuppence, which I hadn't read any of before, the Miss Marples, and then all the other things that aren't part of a series. Also, the book she wrote under this pen name Mary Westmacott, which my library doesn't have, so I've been looking for. Anyway, I think I found some PDFs online. It's a lot easier for me to read physical books most of the time, because if I'm holding my phone, my brain pulls me in 5 different directions and I end up just kind of stuck scrolling, but not always. So we'll see. Yeah. So anyway, I've been learning a bit about, so I first just wrote down all the titles, and then I went back and wrote down the dates of publication for everything. So like the first book she wrote was The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which starts out with, it's centered around Hastings, Captain Hastings, and then Poirot comes in a little ways into it, and he's our sleuth, our detective for the novel. And I know she wrote it first. She had that idea, or she had the idea for the plot because she worked as a nurse or something. She worked in hospitals during the First World War. So she wrote, The Mysterious Affair at Styles was published in 1921. I'm not sure how long it took her to write it, but it's about poisons, and kind of a clever, a devious and clever way to poison someone. Yeah. Anyway, so I know she was interested in that because she had learned about poisons and medications and things working as a nurse, working in healthcare in the First World War, and not, it wasn't that she was interested in writing mysteries, so she studied poisons, which is fun. But the next book she wrote, or the book published, the next one she published, is called A Secret Adversary, and that's the first of the Tommy and Tuppence series, which I hadn't read, but they're about two, very British, very young people who are both kind of at loose ends in the early 20s because of the war and the slump in the economy afterwards. So they both had things to do in their lives until 1918 and for some time afterwards, but don't now. So they're like old friends who meet up and then have adventures. And so I'm reading the first book, or the first book about in their series is just one story. It's a novel length story. The next one that I'm reading now is a series, a collection of short stories, and I like they're a funny bickering couple, and Tuppence, the woman partner, is smarter a lot of the time. Anyway, so there's a lot there that I like. It's a fun read. It's also because I was jumping around at first in what I was reading of hers. I've kind of, to fill in the gap, since I'm having to request things anyway, I'm now kind of trying to fill in the earlier books, and then I'll move on to all the later books. So I've read most of the books she published in the 20s. I've got a few more, but she published books from 1921 all the way up, I believe, until the year she died in 1976. So, 55 years she's writing books. Anyway, so one of the first books that I read this year is a standalone kind of spy novel called Passenger to Frankfurt, which I did not like. So, but it has some fun, we have a fun protagonist who's just kind of like a quirky guy. I thought I needed more black, maybe I don't. Anyway, fun protagonist, just kind of a quirky guy, but it's about how there's a secret, like secret conspiracy controlling all these student protests all over the world, because there's no reason that young people, so that's a later book, so it was published in 1970, so written during the 60s, late 60s, during protests against the war in Vietnam and all these different things. And when there have been rebellions and independence, countries gaining independence from the British Empire. Anyway, but her, not even a thesis of the book, but just maybe a thesis of the book, but just kind of like the truth that is being revealed in the story is about, there's this secret organization. I believe it's five big players controlling, drugs and weapons, and I don't even remember what they all are. And some of it, like, I just think it's, if anyone, I don't know, wants to do kind of an in-depth study on this book, contrasting, like, learning about things that she actually, because she's an insightful woman, and has some insightful things to say, partially about how, Nazis didn't entirely go away after World War II was over. And that's part of the problem. They're part of the bad guys. And they have, but a lot of it, so there are some things like that, have some, at least ring true to me to some extent. They're describing some real things about the world, in that there are still these we know there have been these white supremacist groups often doing very stealthy things. Like, we know the KKK at a certain point kind of stopped holding meetings or anything and encouraged members to join police forces. So, and even further undermined the safety of a lot of minorities in the U.S. for past several decades. But anyway, so that's a true thing that could feel kind of like a conspiracy, but it feels very much, reading this, it felt very much like an old, an elderly British lady going, people can't possibly dislike the empire, so there has to be a conspiracy here. Anyway, that was my impression, and mostly I just did not like it. Like, it's pretty tedious, because I think a lot of what she does really well is her insightful little, like, character studies and interactions where, whoever her detective is will have a lot of insight into the people that they're talking to and interacting with, and be able to tell from that when they're lying or different things, which, to some extent, as an author, like, you don't actually have to be insightful because you're writing it, so you're deciding what the secrets are and you can reveal them. But she has some real interesting things about, a lot of interesting characters and a lot of different types of people who are her characters. Okay, but then, as I've gone through and read through the books of the 20s, one of the first handful of Poirot novels is The Big Four, which, let's see, what year were you? 1927. And that's a similar thing. I think I've seen it in, I grew up watching a lot of, like, the David Suchet Poirot on PBS with my mother, and I think they broke up that book into a few different shorter stories, partially because, in my opinion, the big conspiracy thing is not realistic or all that interesting, because it just isn't, because it's a similar thing, she's writing at that time in the 20s. So there's been revolutions in Russia and in China, and there's a lot of change happening since the end of the First World War. And so she's not old, but she's a young, very British lady, writing about how there can't just be this can't just be lots of people who have the same anger and frustrations in all these different places. There has to be some single power controlling them, which I think is also really unhelpful, because even though now, in 2025 in the US, there are definitely, money and behind the scenes powers that are that influence our politics and influence our world, right? And I'm sure that's always been the case as long as our current systems of government and capitalism have been in place to some extent, in some ways. But the way that she's interested in writing it, both in the Big Four in the 20s and then Passenger to Frankfurt in the 70s, is that there is one conspiracy, like the Big Four there's the greatest mind in China and a great scientist in France and an American millionaire and this mysterious, unknown murderer in Britain. And those are the big four, and there are these four people who are secretly controlling, all these different protests and revolutions, and they're all everything that ordinary people are doing, unionizing and protesting awful working conditions. And anyway, all these different things are not actually because regular people want to do them. It's because there's some evil millionaires or evil powerful people behind the scenes, which is just not really how it works. And there are often some anti-Semitic stereotypes, which is awful. And in the 20s and into the 30s, some of those stereotypes show up. It's not it's not a neutral thing. I mean, stereotypes and racist stereotypes and different things are never entirely neutral, but this is leading up to World War II, when there's all this increasingly hateful rhetoric around Jewish people and how they're not really citizens of whatever country they live in, but actually something else, can never be truly loyal and are possibly connected to whatever this big conspiracy is. So anyway, that's some disappointment from Dame Maggie, which I knew was going to end up being a lot of what I think about when I'm not actually reading her books, partially because I'm familiar with a lot of the mysteries, so reading them is very much just fun, but then the things that kind of stick in my mind are thinking about kind of the historical context she's in and the implications of what she's saying. But yeah, let's see. She wrote, I've only read one of the standalone books she wrote in the 20s. That's The Secret of Chimneys. And when that was made into a TV series, I think it was made into a Miss Marple story when it isn't. So I watched that yet. So we'll see what they did with it. But yeah, it's I don't know. There's a lot of interest. I grew up really liking. Oh, yeah, I was going to talk about. Grew up watching Poirot with my mother and other mysteries, but Poirot has been my favorite. I think our favorite. But so I've seen a lot of them, especially the ones that were produced before I finished high school. And there were a few more series on the BBC after that. So I'm catching up. But I'm not watching them now until I've reread everything. But I read some books, but I had kind of a strange, like a lot of weird kids, neurodivergent kids, anxious kids, a lot of kids in general. I really like to read, but I had kind of a strange relationship to books, in that it was pretty rare for me to find something new, and well, I honestly don't know how strange that is. I think it's probably not as strange, but it was in general, but I was pretty intense, where it would just be really, I just would really like to reread the same books, and there were a number of them. I reread The Hobbit a bunch of times, and I reread Redwall and Mossflower and a few of those books, and not even going to be able to think of them now. Let's see what I have on my shelf. Not much help. Oh, I reread a lot of Roald Dahl over and over again. But anyway, partially because I knew I liked them, but also because I knew they wouldn't, I knew what happened. So it wasn't stressful. And I read generally often, not only, but often, to be as an escape, in a place where I just wanted, didn't want any stressful surprises. I just wanted to read. Anyway, so that's part of why I decided to read all of her books this year, because I've read a handful of them. There are a few of them that I've read a bunch of times, like Crooked House and the ABC Murders and Murder on the Orient Express, and I'm not even sure what else. I know I read Death on the Nile, but I don't think I read it that many times. I was young. I hadn't read any of the Marples. Yeah. So I sometimes read other ones. Like, I had read more than those, but I think I reread those 3 a lot because I knew what they were. And I also had kind of this scarcity anxiety, and I'm not sure exactly where that came from or how that manifested, but I did always feel like also I needed to be saving things. Like, I didn't want to read everything in a series or by an author that I knew I liked, because then there wouldn't be any left. And not that I would be like looking forward to them, you're like saving them for a specific time. I just felt like, there's a finite number of stories or books in the world, and I have to be careful not to finish them all up, which obviously is not true. I mean, I guess technically there's a finite number of books in the world, but it's way more than one person can ever read. And by the time, even if you could read all of the books that have been published before 2025, you would then need to read all the books published this year, or anyway. But, and I think that concern came from, I don't know, all my grandparents grew up during the 20s and 30s. They're all born in the 20s, so grew up, kind of were becoming conscious of the world either during the Great Depression or during the interwar period in Germany, and then the war. So there's a lot of trauma and anxiety from those periods of time. I know a lot of our grandparents, ancestors kind of hoarded after living through those times, because it always feels like you don't know. Yeah. I think, they have memories of just wishing for one more, wishing they had one more thing to eat, even if it was old and out of date, or wishing they had one more, whatever, like thing to do or thing to barter, whatever, just wishing. So we just kind of fill up the corners, just fill up. My Oma, who grew up in Germany, she was born in 1927, so she turned 18 in 1945. She especially hoarded food and would just always have. It was like whenever people would visit, we'd be going through and looking at expiration dates on everything in the cupboards and different things. And she wouldn't, because it's better to have, a freezer full or a cupboard full of stale or expired food that still might be edible than to have nothing. But anyway, and my other grandmother just kept, her house was just kind of full of stuff. But anyway, so I think that anxiety was with me in different ways, and hit, however, for whatever reason, hit my own weird brain or own anxiety. Because I do feel that, I think it's important to recognize kind of the traumas that have shaped who we are and how we ended up this way as individuals and as families and communities and countries. But I do also, at least for myself, want to blame it partially on just the special ways that I'm weird. Because I don't do, it's not all. Anyway, so part of for whatever reason, that morphed in my weird brain into just feeling like I needed to know, it felt better knowing that there were more out there, that I hadn't used them all up yet. And I've been finding it's healthy for me to not do that as an adult, and to actually use things, not save the good things for later, and I know that reading really helps me feel like myself. Anyway, so I've been reading. This is kind of a longer ramble than I meant it to be, and I have not made a whole lot of progress on this little skull. But I'm going to report back soon with more thoughts, maybe on the next decade of Agatha Christie novels, maybe on just some different, I don't know. Maybe I'll just pick a specific one and talk about it a little more, because I'm not going to worry too much. I'll try and shout out what I'm going to talk about before I do, but I'm not going to be super worried about spoilers for these books that were published up to a century ago, between 50 and 100 years ago. So anyway, I'm about halfway through. I don't know if I'm going to read all of them, especially not all the standalone novels. If there are a lot of spy novels in there, I'm not going to do it, because I don't want to read more about Mrs. Christie's concerns about international, anti-Semitic conspiracy stereotypes, whatever. Anyway. So that's my feeling overall. If there's an overall summary to be had here, read an Agatha Christie novel. Think about, read it just to enjoy it if you like. If you want to think about bigger things, think about the year it was written and what she's saying. And I recommend not reading anything if it looks like a spy novel. So I hope you're doing well, and I'll talk to you again soon.